All right, everyone. Thanks again for being here. My name is Margaret Stern, and I'm the Program and Communications Director here for the Susitna River Coalition. For those of you that don't know, because I think we have a pretty broad group of folks here today, the Susitna River Coalition is a small grassroots organization that is focused on watershed health, and we are up in Talkeetna, Alaska. We formed in response to the Susitna-Watana Hydro Project, which Chris here will talk about in a little bit. But we have since kind of expanded our focus to all kinds of things that have the capacity to affect the Susitna watershed, whether it's monitoring the West Susitna Access Project or engaging in utility elections or education projects and events like this. We are a voice and a resource for the people of the Susitna Valley and the Susitna watershed, and we love getting to communicate with our membership and share some of the great stories of people that have traveled down the Susitna or have a unique connection to the watershed. So first of all, this is the first Winter Speaker Series event of the 2025-2026 season. So please look for a few more events coming down the pipeline here. And a big thank you to the Jessica Stevens Community Foundation for making the Winter Speaker Series event possible. They are the sponsors of this series. So tonight we have Chris Dunn here to give us a talk on his experiences in the Susitna watershed. So before I pass the screen over to Chris, I would like to say that he's a former Alaskan resident that has traveled thousands of miles in Alaska from Barter Island to Caines Head. And after leaving Alaska in 2015, Chris got a PhD in environmental studies from the University of Colorado-Boulder, and he finished that in 2021. Now, Chris is a researcher, he's a photographer and an outdoor adventurer, and I really encourage you to check out his website, Chris Dunn on Planet Earth, which is a really fun website to go through and see his photographs and read the stories of his adventures. This trip on the Susitna that he's going to tell us about today was one of the first and most ambitious trips, in his own words, that he undertook. And it's yeah, I really encourage you to take a look at his website and ask questions throughout the webinar. If you like, you can utilize the chat down at the base of your screen, and you can ask any questions throughout the webinar and we'll get them answered for you. And with that, I will pass the screen over to Chris. So thanks everyone for being here.
So am I the center frame now?
You are not quite the center frame, but
Okay.
we're shared, and you can start
Okay,
sharing
okay.
your screen whenever you like.
I see. Okay. Well, before I mask myself, this is me. I'm Chris, and thank you for coming, mysterious people that I can't see. Um, and thank you for that kind introduction. So I will start the slideshow and share it, and hopefully that all works. In just a second.
That's
Sorry.
Zoom is always an exciting.
Yeah, I hit start slideshow and then it wouldn't let me share, so I'm trying
Oh,
it the other way.
there we
No.
go. It's
Slideshow.
it's yeah.
Are you seeing the slideshow?
I'm seeing the slideshow. I'm seeing your speaker notes.
Okay, well then you're not seeing the slideshow. Darn it. 1 second.
Yeah, not a problem.
Oh, here we go. I got it.
Cool.
Okay.
Perfect.
Are you seeing my slides? Sorry.
Yes, we can see your
Okay.
slides.
Without the speaker notes.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right. So from glacier to the sea, following the entirety of Alaska's Susitna River. So I completed this journey in 2012 to 2013. And I'm going to give a little bit of backstory and a little bit more about me before I jump into talking a little bit about the Susitna Dam issue and a little bit more about energy in Alaska, and then the journey itself. So some of the backstories, I have given this presentation before, actually a number of times, including in Talkeetna twice, but it hasn't been since 2013 that I have. And I finished this journey in fall 2013, probably September, October, I think September. And then just a couple months later, I gave the first one in Talkeetna, and there was a little article that was wrote up in the local public media. And I've given a few times to classes, including in Colorado when I was in the PhD program, and I did one in Anchorage at the Anchorage Library. So it's gone through a few iterations, and then I've incorporated it into some other presentations too. But recently I saw this particular article that said, Alaska Utility execs to lawmakers, let's revive Susitna Hydroelectric mega project. And I said, well, that's interesting. You know, this is still maybe still percolating in the conversation. I haven't kept up very well. So I wrote to Susitna River Coalition and I said, hey, you know, I did this journey and I have this website. I did this like write up and photographs, and I don't know if anybody remembers it, so I'll just send it to you. And then Margaret wrote me back and said, hey, do you want to do a presentation? And I was like, yeah, sure. I haven't done it in a while. Why not? That wasn't necessarily what I was gunning for, but that sounds great. So that's kind of how this all started. And it was a great excuse to kind of go back and really dig through what I had and try to improve it a little bit and things like that. The only thing I'll say is some of the facts are a little bit older, and I have a PhD, but this isn't like a PhD dissertation, like the results of that, but there's some good stuff in here. So also recent news came from American Rivers, which is obviously a river advocacy organization in America. American Rivers announces Alaska's Susitna River is one of America's most endangered rivers of 2025. So this is timely. So a little bit more backstory about me. As Margaret mentioned, this was kind of the first, and I say one of the most ambitious journeys I had done. And it was the first of a series of what became Glaciers to Sea expeditions. And I've done a couple more in Alaska, to the Beaufort Sea twice. One was the Anaktuvuk to the Colville River to the Beaufort Sea. See some pictures of it here on my left. And then the Jago River through the Arctic Refuge in 2015. And then in 2021, I did what you might call a sea to Glaciers to Sea. I crossed the Nusawak Peninsula. This was I spent a whole summer in Greenland doing various projects, research, journalism, things like that. And my main goal for this was to get on the Greenland ice sheet by human power. And I did so. And I got to the sea and I survived. And it was really, really hard and really scary. That's the short version of that. And then in 2024, I did another sea to Glaciers to Sea where I crossed Iceland. And I recently presented in Montana on this one. And then one other one I did was kind of just a glaciers only expedition, which was a climb up Lhotse in 2019 as part of a research expedition. And I did have the idea. I was like, you know, I should do a glacier to sea out of this. I should climb it and I should float all the way to the Bay of Bengal. And it just didn't work out. It was a pretty ambitious idea. And then I learned later in 2011, which was years before I'd even attempted this, these two crazy Nepalese guys climbed Everest, paraglided off, and then kayaked all the way to the coast of Bangladesh. So they've done a version, power to them. And there's a documentary on this story I encourage you to look up because there's things I'm not going to say because that's not what this is about, but it's a really crazy, interesting expedition. So then I've also folded this Glaciers to the Sea stuff into a broader theme that I call Expeditions with Purpose, and I presented that in one version of the intersection of adventure photography with pressing environmental issues. So let's get back to Alaska. Another way that this has been folded in is I started doing these long river trips and land trips, and I noticed that I was starting to almost cross the entirety of Alaska from north to south. And the Susitna River obviously was a really big chunk of miles for that. And then I ended up adding some things that brought me up to Nenana to the north. And then some river trips going south and north from the Brooks Range brought me to the Beaufort Sea and then down to Allakaket. So I just have this little section from Allakaket to Nenana that I was like, I'm going to do that. I'm going to do it in one summer. And then it's been like 7 years and I haven't done it. So it might happen. I'm not sure. But it's the Yukon Basin there, which is not so easy. There's some challenges to cross that. I might try it as a winter trip or do a really long meandering connection of rivers. Anyway, a little bit more backstory. What brought me to Alaska in the first place, I'm not from there, was I started working seasonally in 2006. And I ended up doing, I think, 6 seasons in Denali. But I say I've lived in Alaska 9 seasons total, which included a full winter. And so I'm just showing some pictures of Denali. That was kind of my home base. The mountain, by the way, is amazing, but it never looks like this, but every once in a while it does. So one of the trips I did in 2012 was I went out to the Denali Highway, and I don't remember what my purpose was. I think it was bad weather, and I was going to do a little simple day hike or backpacking stuff. And I stopped at this lodge, which was called the Gracious House Lodge on the Susitna River. And I went in, and nobody was there, and I got a beer and something to eat. And I was talking with the lodge owners, and they were like, the I know it was Butch, and I can't remember his wife's name, but she was like, "Oh, they're gonna build this big dam down on the Susitna," and I was just looking at that big river, and she said, "Well, there's," I was like, "Oh, I should float that. That'd be cool." She's like, "No, no, you can't. There's this huge canyon called Devil's Canyon. Nobody can float that." And I don't know, just all of a sudden it just clicked in my head, like I'm gonna do this whole river somehow and make a story out of it with the dam. And I don't know, I don't really know why it occurred to me to do it. It was just that just sounds like a thing to do, and I want to do it. So I set myself that fall because I was working during the summer. I was like, that fall I'm going to do it, the whole thing. And I know Alaska fall is basically winter, but that was the idea. And I started planning right away to do it. And by the way, that lodge has now become changed ownership, is now the Clearwater Mountain Lodge. So let's get into the journey. Well, actually, I'm going to talk about energy and stuff first. But moving straight into the Susitna. So just a little bit of graphics and maps just to kind of orient you. I'm not going to tell you like all about land ownership and stuff, but that's what this map shows. Gives you an idea of the proposed dam site, the reservoir, the watershed as a whole. So you can see Talkeetna's somewhere right around here where I'm pointing, and the Susitna River comes down from the Alaska Range. I recently learned it's called the Hayes section of the Alaska Range, or the Hayes Range. And the Upper Susitna contributes about 17% to the Big Susitna, which flows into the Cook Inlet. And you can see there's the Chulitna, Talkeetna, and the Yentna is massive, coming from Denali area. And then just to give you a sense, like this is a little bit of an older graphic that shows at the time some planned possible transmission corridors or transportation corridors or the that current version in the 2011 timeframe of what the dam and reservoir site could be, which actually has changed over time. I'll talk a little bit about that. So some facts, and then I'll promise this will turn into adventure and photography. So the Susitna Dam has been proposed since 1948. Oh, the 1948. It's been studied since the 60s, especially the 80s though, and then it was kind of resurrected in 2008 and studied through about 2016, I want to say, and then it was nixed that time. And some of this, it would have been set about 705 feet high, which would be one of the highest dams in the US and among the top in the world, with about a 42-mile long reservoir, 1 to 2 miles wide, about 625 approximately at its deepest point, 5.2 billion estimated cost. I'm sure that's way wrong at this point. Year 3 of 3 in a environmental assessment. Goal for startup. This is kind of interesting. It's my old slide, 2025. Obviously, that didn't happen. And then why is there a dam? Well, there was this I don't know, there was some kind of legislation passed that made an official goal of 50% renewable energy by 2025, which we can see in a minute if Alaska accomplished that. And then Susitna Dam supposedly would have accounted for 50% of that goal, about 600 megawatt anticipated. And then population of Alaska. The point there is basically that most people live in the rail belt region, which I'll talk about what that is. That's kind of what I'm zoomed in on here. This is an older map of kind of energy sources throughout the entirety of Alaska with some zoom in on the rail belt. But the rail belt basically runs from Fairbanks down to Seward, which is where the railroad runs. And that's where most people live and most energy is used. Um, let's see, Fairbanks through Anchorage to the Kenai Peninsula represents 75% of Alaska's electric load. I'm quoting from an official document or a study. And just to give you a little sense of kind of the energy makeup of the rail belt, this is from the EPA Power Profiler, which I looked up today, and I'm amazed it still exists. And it still tells you some apparently accurate information about emissions and things like that. But basically, the rail belt uses more gas than the national average, similar coal, way less nuclear, but no nuclear, a bit more hydro, less wind, and then more oil, looks like. And it emits a bit more CO2 than the national average. So Alaska has a decent amount of renewables and a lot of renewable potential. There's a few existing sites and then a lot of proposed sites, or at least there were. I haven't dug into this quite as deeply as I did back then, but the Susitna Dam would have been by far the largest at 600 megawatts. And then you can see some of these others like Spur Geothermal would have been pretty big and some other stuff. So I started nerding out today and I was like digging through these like energy reports and I found these maps just a minute ago actually. Wind resources of Alaska's rail belt, potential hydropower and solar PV. I'm not going to say much about it, but just look at the red. That's kind of where solar could be. The blue dots show you where hydro could be, and you can see Susitna-Watana has a red star here. It looks to be one of the few proposed, and then some wind resources. And I took this photo one day when I was climbing around the boundary area of Denali Park. I'm looking out towards Healy. This is the Healy coal plant, and you can see the Eva Creek wind farm up on this ridge. This is what at the time, this power plant was not operational, but my understanding is that it is back in operation. And you can actually see a coal mine behind it. And what I used to hear was that most of that, it's like low sulfide, most of it used to get exported to South Korea or something like that. So one of the last things I'll say about energy and the rail belt is that this is kind of showing there's a lot of large mining operations or proposed mining in Alaska, a lot of mega projects. Alaska is kind of just a mega place, a lot of mega mines. Think of mega ideas like nuking uh, harbors and all kinds of stuff. And the real short on this is that if you add up basically all the energy needs for all this mining, it basically equals the Susitna River Dam, about 600 megawatts. And so some people at the time were suspecting that the Susitna River Dam was more a strategy to get these big mining operations going, more, rather than really shifting to renewable energy for end user consumers in the rail belt. So I don't know if that's true, but it is interesting that if you look at that, it does sort of add up. And those statistics are a little bit older, but all right, so let's get into the journey itself. So I was working in the summer, so I couldn't just take off and do it right away and do it in the summer, which is the time that you would make sense to do it. But I was like, I'm going to do it in the fall, and I don't care if it's cold. I'm going to get a dry suit and wear a bunch of thick clothes. And actually, it's going to be awesome because Devil's Canyon flow is going to be so low that I bet I can just float it. And probably that's all true. But I did the first section in fall of 2012 and it was like snowing on me and my hands were freezing and I was like, I don't really want to do that. So I was like, I'll come back in next summer. And then I finished. So I started in fall 2012, I did the upper section, and then in summer 2013, I did the middle section, I'm going to call it, although some geologists or folks divide it in four sections. And then to Talkeetna, and then I floated in fall 2013 from Talkeetna all the way to Anchorage. So the total distance of the journey was actually 400 miles. The river miles, or the Susitna River flows 310 miles. So some versions that were on the internet were saying that I floated the entirety of the Susitna. That's actually not true. I don't have the skill level to float Devil's Canyon, which I'll talk about. I floated all of it, but about 5.5 miles. And I'll get to Devil's Canyon in a second. But um, so I've been claiming, and I believe it's true, that this is the first and only human-powered river trip down the entire length of the Susitna River. But I am totally open to corrections, like, hey, I know my buddy did that, or some old gold miner did it. Um, I know probably lots of jet boaters and stuff have like seen all the sections, but they haven't done it human powered from top to bottom or bottom to top. But that's I've been saying that, so but I welcome throw in if you have heard otherwise. Um, so I wanted to do the whole river because I like this idea that it was kind of like this single thing, and I wanted to like think of it that way and know it that way and present it that way. That if you're studying like the dam site, it's like, oh, it's this one little place and the reservoir is like this. But I'm like, no, no, it's like this whole one big thing. And I like that idea. And there just aren't that many totally connected free-flowing rivers left relatively in the world. So I just like, this is something cool that I could do. So, and there's kind of like three big main challenges that I faced. One was the upper section, getting up into like the glaciated region. The second was Devil's Canyon. The third was kind of like the delta and the ocean. And I'll spend a little more time with each of those. But I also just didn't know a lot. There's just a lot of unknown for me. I was relatively new to the country, and I was pretty much a new pack rafter. So I was just like, I'm just doing this. I was like 29, so I was still in my 20s and just could be like, screw it, that's what's going to happen. And so you can see on the left, this is an aerial shot. And I want you to notice a couple things. One, notice these lakes, these long lakes and big lakes running atop the glacier. And then off in the distance, that's Mount Hayes, which is the highest peak in kind of the central Alaska range. And notice this big ridge kind of to the right and this kind of gray sediment below it. You can see what's called a trim line. I'll talk more about that later, but you'll see this ridge come up again. All right. So I started in the fall and I started from the Denali Highway and I just made a loop. I just drove myself and floated right back to my vehicle. And I basically became tundra really quickly. I was crossing tundra and seeing beautiful rainbows and caribou, and it rained a lot and it was cold, but it was great. And I went up through the Clearwater Mountains, which you can see here. And I named this photograph the Zen Erratic because it looked to me like a finely placed Zen garden where it's right over the stream. It's just like so perfect. And it's like the way it's cleanly split. And so if you don't know what an erratic is a geological phenomena where this area was like completely covered in ice at one point. And when those glaciers were coming down, they were ripping off ice. And then basically when they receded, they dropped rocks that are a little bit different than the surrounding geology, immediately surrounding geology. That's why they're erratic. So this, by the way, is huge. I don't have scale here, but bigger than me, I'm sure. So I got over to the east fork of the Susitna, and this is the East Fork Glacier. And you can see that trim line is really distinct below that mountain summit. You see the cloud line, and below that, kind of in a parallel with the cloud line, is the trim line. Basically, that shows the extent, like kind of like the last maximum extent of where that glacier uh, was. And so you can see how much thicker it was right there and how much further out it went. And I took this in 13 years ago. So I can only imagine, obviously there are people that study this. I haven't seen it or kept up with it, but I can only imagine it's probably behind that bend almost by now. Um, and so I kind of have a little draw to go back into this country and see what these glaciers are up to, but who knows? I have a lot of other things I like to do. So I ended up crossing this kind of, you see where all that like sediment is towards the end of the lake. I didn't want to set up my boat just because it's a lot of work. So I just crossed right through all that. I connected it, and it almost connected, I had to like do a little bit of wading. And then sometimes it's just like full on, like I think I was like carrying my pack a little bit, like up to my chest. And there was no current, so I could do that here. But it was obviously cold. If you haven't backpacked and traveled in Alaska, then wet feet is just like get over it. That's just the way it is, almost always. And so I was just stomping through that. Oh, by the way, that maximum extent of where this glacier lie was probably the Little Ice Age, which was kind of a regional phenomenon, mostly in the northern hemisphere in North America and Europe, where the glaciers were at their most recent maximum extent in the 19th century. All right, so I got to the main Susitna Glacier, which is you're looking up again. Remember, there's Mount Hayes off in the distance there in the clouds coming down, and um, what in this top photo, and what you can see heading off to the right is the Black Rapids Glacier, which follows a fault line, basically paralleling the whole central Alaska range there, and it's not uncommon that people will ski that or hike through there, follow that fault line. Or on occasion, people climb Mount Hayes, obviously. And then looking the other way in the bottom photo, that's that I'm standing right on that ridge that I told you to pay attention to earlier. And to my right, below, is the main Susitna Glacier. So what the above photo would be at my back at that point when I'm looking this way. And I don't think you can see my mouse pointing, I'm not sure, but you can see off to the left in that bottom photo, that's the east fork of the Susitna flowing. And then coming from the right, way right, that's the west fork. And then the main Susitna produces the middle, the main, and they all join kind of just in this photo and then head off towards the Talkeetna Mountains. So these are some other photos that I did not take, um, historic photos and scientific photos. The one on the left is from about 1970, and the one on the right is probably from around 2012. It's a satellite photo. And one thing to notice is how much more solid and thick that glacial ice is, especially in 1970. Those big lakes that were near that ridge aren't there at all. But you can see them in this satellite photo, those same lakes. That's basically, it looks exactly like that photo on the right with the red basically looks exactly like what I traversed when I was there. So I started out and I was like, you know what? I think the way to do this is to paddle the lakes on the glacier. That's way easier than trying to walk through all this moraine on the glacial ice. And so I could have done this like easier ways, but I really wanted to like get intimate with the watershed, the ice and the water. And so I put in a lot of extra effort to make that happen. And so, I could have just walked beside the glacier or something somewhere, but like, no, I want to get up in there. I want to immerse myself. So anyway, as you can see, starting out, it was just beautiful weather, a lovely summer day. Um, and I did inflate my boat and I put it on this is this big long lake, by the way, that you saw closest to the ridge. And I was just paddling along and I saw this really cool ice cavern on one side. So I very don't do this at home disclaimer. I got up inside it and it was kind of dripping everywhere and it was really just incredible. This is just looking the other way, basically from that ice cavern. And I basically paddled to the end of that long lake, and it was just a beautiful, perfect way to go. Um, the thing to notice in this top photo is there's this line following behind my boat that snakes down to the back of that ice. Basically, because of all that snow, it kind of formed this like slushy layer that I paddled through. You can see just a different angle of that. So there's kind of a big gap following that to basically the toe of the glacier, the end of the glacier, which is what you see in this top photo, because it got really, really hard. And when things get really hard in Alaska, it's really easy just to like shut off like documentation and photography and everything. It's just like surviving. And it's something that I've like learned from. This was kind of like the first thing I'd done like this, and I've tried to like learn from it. And I did overcome that a few times on this trip, but I really wish I had like documented more of the things that were going on in that part. But basically, I ended up having to get on the moraine, which moraine is basically like a thin, often thin covering of loose rock and boulders on top of ice and muddy. It's often really muddy and steep and slick. So it just makes for difficult walking and it's really hard to navigate. You just like you're walking up one wall and then you just like see this labyrinth and you don't know what the right way is. And so I ended up having to do a bunch of that. And there was parts that were like quicksand from all the silt piled up. And then I did some paddling through some little lakes here and there. And anyway, it was tiring. And I eventually got to that bigger lake. There was that bigger lake you saw in the photo, and I was kind of paddling through that. And I don't know, and maybe in some other lake. And I kind of saw this like little bit of current coming in, like a stream coming in upstream. And I was like, oh man, like a false promise. But then I saw this one little reed in the lake that was just kind of had these little ripple marks and was just kind of moving. I was like, oh, I got current. Awesome. Like, this is it. I'm like leaving the glacier and getting on the river. And I just started paddling, you know, and then the current kept getting faster and faster. And in my mind, kind of being a little less experienced at the time, I was like, I'm off the glacier. Like just the scenery just looked like vegetation and boulders. I was like, yeah, I'm done with the glacier. I'm on the river. And then suddenly this river just like drops off into nothing. It's just this huge, probably like class 5, 6 or something falls. And I was like, oh, geez, gosh, I think I went through like one class 4 kind of or something section. And then was getting bigger. And so I ended up having to portage some of this stuff. And there was a bunch of these huge drops. So basically, I was just at the toe of the glacier. And this, what you're seeing in the top is the very last one and pretty moderate compared to a lot of them. Just being out in the middle of nowhere by myself in a cold time, and being a less experienced boater, now I probably would have run more of that. But, and ideally be with someone. But this was kind of the way it worked back then, the way it worked out for me at the time. And so anyway, in the bottom photo, I'm like in the true Susitna River, and I'm heading off into the Rainbow, into the Denali Highway Bridge, and just notice how big it is. Like it just right from the beginning, it's just huge. At least in terms of it's how broad. So that ended up the falls section, and I saw a few hunters out there. There were some jet boats, and there was a hunting camp. I kind of stopped in and talked to one of them. I came back the next summer. I had a friend drop me off on the at the Denali Highway Bridge. And this whole section, basically from like where the glacier starts, a good ways down from the bridge. Another thing that makes it really challenging is just really, there's tons of hidden sandbars all in there. The water is hard, it's really opaque, it's hard to see through just because of all the suspended glacial silt. And all that suspended glacial silt, because this part's so slow, just kind of drops slowly and it forms these sandbars that are invisible. So all the time I'm like hitting them and having to like sometimes pick up my boat and move in and stuff like that. So that was kind of the biggest challenge through here. And it's just started to get really lively. There were lots of birds, like these trumpeter swans, bear tracks, all the good large game Alaska animal tracks. I started seeing these trees on the side of the river, and at first I'd see like a bare tree, and I'd be like, "Oh man, the grizzlies, they'll do that. They'll kind of scratch the trees to mark their territory and stuff." And I was like, and then I just kept seeing them all in a row. I was like, "Gosh, those grizzlies are just nuts. Like they got nothing better to do." And then it occurred to me like, "Oh, you know what's going on? This is I didn't know this term. I just learned this actually. These are ice scars from the spring breakup. That layer of ice kind of gets flushed downstream and the water's high. It's just smashing into these trees and eroding the banks and stuff like that. And then there was like some permafrost slough and stuff like this, the drunken forests. I eventually hit the Susitna River, which is this beautiful, brilliant bluish color. You can't really see that in this photo. And there were all along the way, I was encountering a bunch of scientific instruments from the Alaska Energy Authority environmental review studies. I saw like a bat station. It was like the solar panel. And anyway, this one just kind of spun like a cement truck with the current. And it was basically trapping juvenile, after the salmon, I assume it was salmon, they migrate up from the ocean. They get into these side streams usually and they spawn, and then when they hatch, the juveniles hatch, they go downstream. So this was kind of catching them and collecting them in a box. And then the scientists would fly in, probably by helicopter and inject radio tags into them so they could do telemetry and basically see how, are these fish getting down to the ocean and back up and where are they going and stuff like that. And this is just one way that they were monitoring some of this. So I got to Watana Canyon. There's basically two canyons on this Susitna. There's Watana, which is pretty short and small compared to Devil's. It's a couple miles, I guess, and it makes this big M like a McDonald's double arch. And at the time, like I said, I was pretty new to whitewater relatively, and I decided to portage this basically this one rapid, which I think it's usually rated a class 4 plus. Looking at it now, I'm looking at this photo, I'm like, I totally would do that. Like I could sneak that, that's no problem. But that's how I felt at the time. And anyway, I got some nice views of the canyon. And there's a lot of beautiful stuff. So like lupine, dragonflies. It's nice to pay attention to the small things. And you can see I did get some nice weather in this summer section. You see it's kind of sunny. So, one thing I didn't mention about Watana Canyon is that basically, at least at the time, marks the extreme far end of the proposed reservoir. So I think that actually that rapid would have been submerged just enough to not exist uh, if the dam were to be built. So this is an aerial shot that I didn't take of the reservoir site region. And there you see there's a lot of islands in the river. You see some of those sandbars that I was talking about. Those are obviously visible ones, but there's plenty of invisible ones. So I just took a bunch, and I was kind of out there documenting. I saw this as like a big photojournalism project, and so I just taken tons of pictures of the river, and the river's beautiful, but you can only see so many pictures of the river. So I made these like montages to show the changing character of the river, and it kind of skips ahead even to later sections through here. You can see like where Clearwater joins the silty Susitna and stuff like that. And I saw a lot of caribou. Um, I was just amazed by like this particular beach that was just covered in caribou fur. Like, wow, that's a lot of caribou to make that much caribou fur. And I have a little fun stat to throw at you. So this is part of the Nelchina herd, whose population runs around 35,000 to 45,000 members, but it has declined 83% since the early 2000s, like a lot of the herds in Alaska. And a lot of smart people that know more about it debate what's going on there. It's probably a combination of things like climate change and industrial incursion, and could be hunting related. There's different things going on. But one thought I had as I was paddling through is, oh, I wonder why these caribou are hanging out like next to the river and on these little islands. And just from my experience of being out there, especially when I portaged parts of Devil's Canyon later, was they're getting away from the bugs. There's these horrible bugs that live in their noses and in their skin. And if you see I've seen in Denali in the mountains, they'll stand on snow patches and maybe even glaciers sometimes where there's less bugs. And so this is kind of a crucial habitat for them to be basically in this river and along this river. And by the way, this is all areas that would be submerged by the reservoir, at least as proposed in the last iteration. Um, and then also I witnessed, and I'll show you a video, caribou swimming across the river. It's a pretty big river in places. They can swim across it. But I was kind of wondering, like, well, if it was like a big reservoir that was 2 miles wide, that might like really interrupt the habitat a lot more. So these are just things that, as an amateur, basically, I've since read more and know more, but there's things that I was noticing from doing this trip that just I think is part of the value of doing something like this in this way. So I'm in the reservoir. I'm just showing some pictures, like where you see my tent and boat are. That would be totally submerged. I'm kind of getting towards uh, the dam site and some of the deepest areas. And look at all these caribou tracks along this beach. And I found this one cabin site. This is kind of a cache and a little shed, and there was a main cabin, I think. But it just shows that there would be some direct impacts to humans, to like human uh, places of habitation and stuff like that. All right, so here's my caribou friend. Hopefully this loads and plays properly. I think it's taking just a moment to load. That's normal. There we go. Hopefully you hear and see this. For this video, that doesn't matter, but it will matter for another video, so I'm gonna have to reshare it, I think. So anyway, this caribou was kind of running up the left. Poor thing, I better kind of wait back. And then as soon as that caribou kind of went out of view, I saw like some little dots. And then as I got closer, I realized, oh, it's people on an island. And it was these scientists, these Alaska Energy Authority, contracted scientists doing various environmental assessments. And so I pulled onto this little bank with them and hung out and talked to them, and, kind of interviewed them. I was kind of doing the journalism thing. And they were doing a variety of different kinds of studies. Oh, and they told me, they said, oh, we saw this caribou swimming. And then we saw you and we thought, oh, no, they said, we saw you. We thought you were a caribou. And then we saw a caribou and we were very confused. So, they're catching fish and bugs. And the main purpose of all this seemed to be isotope assessment. Basically, they're looking for marine isotopes, which are, gosh, I'm gonna sound like an idiot trying to explain isotopes, but it's kind of like a variant of a chemical that indicates you can learn things about where it comes from, where it's been, and basically marine isotopes, I think it has something to do with nitrogen levels. Um, can tell you if there's a marine indicator, basically it indicates salmon have been making it this way, something like that. Some scientists can come in and say it better than me in a minute. Please do. But that's the basic idea. And they were making like fish throw up. I remember that was a weird one. All these scientists. That's anyway. They're putting bugs in bags. So I hung out with them for a while. I was like, I gotta get going. I got things to do, place to be. I floated down to this island, which I knew I was getting towards Devil's Canyon, and it was kind of like keeping me up at night. And I was like looking at maps like constantly, like I cannot miss the pullout. I can't just like be like going along and just like end up in Devil's Canyon because there's the main oh, I should say what Devil's Canyon is. It's a canyon. The Susitna River. It's the main canyon. It's 11 miles long, and I'll talk a little bit more about the like adventures and tragedies, but people have died trying to do it, like multiple people in kayaks and jet boats. But the main challenge and danger is that there's these gigantic holes, these hydraulics that can just hold you under, and it's freezing cold water, and you can't see, and it would be really scary. I was like, I don't want to deal with that. So I got on this island that looked like it was a good placement for the canyon. I spent the night there, which was amazing. And there's this little telemetry station and it was open. So I opened it up and there's this paperwork inside and one of the forms said Devil's Island. I was like, oh, that's a cool name. So I was camping on Devil's Island. And I could see where the helicopter pads had like landed. There was boot tracks, and I could see they just went straight to the station and straight back. I was like, all right, well, it's all business, you know. And as I had that door open, I noticed there was a like an indicator light, and it just turned on at that moment and like glowed red for a little while, and it kind of flickered out. And I was like, oh, that's cool. That must mean that a king salmon, who are the only ones that can get above Devil's Canyon, was just powering upriver just past me just now. But of course, I don't really know. So I got down to Devil's Canyon and I pulled out in just the right time. Um, and I really wanted to see Devil's Canyon. That was like a big draw for me. So I put in a ton of effort to like get as close to the river as and be on the river as often as possible. And so this picture on the left, you can get a sense that the rock changes. It just becomes this much harder. You're kind of getting into like this more bedrock of the Talkeetna Mountains. Basically, what's happening is the river hits the Talkeetna Mountains and it has nowhere to go, and it's just like slicing into it. So it gets more narrow and it gets in this hard rock. Anyway, this picture on the left is kind of like some of the earlier rapids, and then this one on the right is called Hotel Rock, which is one of the more infamous. And basically, remember that giant river that you saw at the right below the glacier? Like that whole thing is shoved into this little tiny area, and you can see the size of the trees there. Like it's incredible how small it gets, and then it's just blocked by a giant rock. So you have like these two tiny little, and basically behind that, the whole river becomes a giant hole. And unless you hit it exactly right, not in a pack raft, with a kayak that can slice in exactly the right way, like you'll get in that hole and you'll never get out. So that's the kind of thing that and it's, if you look at it from above, you might not think too much of it. You'd be like, oh, that's a cute little rock or something. Um, so I had read ahead of time Andrew Embick's Fast Coal, the Guide to Alaska Whitewater. And he kind of had these descriptions of the rapids, but he didn't tell you, and he kind of had them in order, but he didn't tell you like where is it relative to anything and what's in between. And he's like, this is like expert kayakers, like world-class kayakers. If there's like a class four, they might not even mention it. And I'm just in a paragraph. So I'm like, well, I really hope that this works out. And I hope I can like I don't get to a point where it's just like sheer cliffs on either side and the current's really quick and I can't portage. So there's just things like that that were a lot of anxiety producing and made this a proper adventure, I would say. So I have a picture here of Andy Embick in Valdez. That's where he lived. I think he was a doctor. Um, he ran all stuff all over Alaska and wrote this book. And then Walt Blackadar was the first person. He might have been a doctor too. I can't remember. But he was in Idaho. He was the first person to kayak Devil's Canyon. And interestingly, they both met tragic deaths. just as an aside. But so I have this uh, description from Fast and Cold about Devil's Canyon that I'm going to read to you. Devil's Canyon is the biggest whitewater on the continent and some of the biggest ever run in the world. Sections of the Indus in Pakistan, the Yangtze in China, and the Stikine and Alsek in Canada are comparable. Described as the Mount Everest of kayaking, the rapids have a roar which sounds like a couple of 747s taking off. Standing on the bank scouting, one can almost feel the ground shake with the power of the awesome hydraulics. Flying in a couple thousand feet above the canyon, the huge waves are visible far below as their crests explode into spray and foam. For the few kayakers who attempt to run it, the mental impact of the run is greater than any other they'll ever make. Devil's Canyon veterans, even a decade later, can just shut their eyes and the whole run will come back to them. So great an impression does it make. The canyon is a classic, overwhelming force encountering an immovable object. And Devil's Canyon here, I want to emphasize this. Devil's Canyon is not really a reasonable portage. So potential canyon runners need to be highly committed. All right. Well, he might have been being a little bit over the top with some of that, but I think that's more or less right. And I ended up actually, and like kayak technology and techniques have changed a little bit, but it's more or less right, I think, still. I ended up interviewing a kayaker who had run it with a group. I think his name was Jeff Shelton or something like that. It's been a while, but yeah, he was like, yeah, it was amazing and all this. So I have a short video. There's no sound for this one just yet, but when actually, I think I'm going to end the slideshow real quick. Actually, I'm going to play this and I'm going to end the slideshow because I have one. So this is Devil Creek. It's really hard to get a sense of it. It's kind of lines nothing. You can see all these giant holes everywhere. And when you're a kayak, you just have to like be super precise, zigging and zagging your way through, or you could die, basically. All right. So I floated 5 of the 11 miles of the canyon, but it took me 3 days to go 11 miles. So that's really slow, and it was really hard. And there was intense bushwhacking. The portage was really not very reasonable. So on the left, you can see I'm just like splitting through this thick vegetation. And on the right, this is like more the penultimate. It's basically just like sheer cliff there with like, but it's not like, well, maybe not sheer, but it's like these jagged rocks. But it's more or less a cliff covered in moss with these alders just sticking out. And so I was kind of like scaling through the alders, like going up and down that way. And they were all in my way, so I have to like snake through them without getting my pack caught, not falling. And so some stuff was like that. That was pretty gnarly. Just everything you can imagine. It was it was difficult. And this gives you some sense of kind of the vegetation and some like this particular section along the banks. And I was making my way through those floating sections, and obviously the floats were glorious when I could do them. It was like such a relief to be out of the bush and the cliffs and everything. And I ended up kind of basically what happens, the Alaska Range kind of in a big semicircle, and the Susitna River kind of starts going south, but then it curves to get through the Talkeetna Mountains, and it kind of almost kind of curves back to meet the Alaska Range towards Denali Park. And so I ended up seeing the Western Alaska Range, and I believe this is Mount Forker off in the distance there. So I'm getting deeper into Devil's Canyon, almost towards the end. Notice I was just playing. I was trying to get a shot of myself, like posing, and the timer didn't work, so I was just playing around. But notice this like bridge off in the distance there, and you'll see that in this slide. That's that bridge. So this was like left over from I think the 1980 study. It just enabled them to fly in and get across the river to do whatever they were doing. Obviously, it's inoperable now. I wonder if it's still there. And one of the things that I had to do to try to get through the canyon was sometimes I'd have to go up and down to get across over these like places that were just truly sheer cliff. There was no way. And I'd have to go up and I tried different things. I'd be like, I'm gonna go way up, and I bet it might be easier. But actually the brush kept getting thicker and harder. So there was no winning. But anyway, I ended up it was interesting because I ended up finding like this, which was this survey monument, kind of at a little peak, and then this like abandoned electrical gauge of some sort, probably a river gauge. And this is Devil's Gorge, which is kind of like the steepest, narrowest, continuous section. And just to give you a sense of like just how gnarly this terrain is in terms of bushwhacking. And there's no true rim. It just kind of keeps going up. There's like distant mountains that it's like the bottom of a big deep valley, basically. So some people have, of course, hiked, along those ridges, but I was trying to be near the river. And just to give you more of a sense of like the way the cliffs would just slice down. And it's like obviously it'd be really hard to like get through that. You have to go around it and stuff. So I was kind of working my way through and I heard this like rumbling sound. I looked down and there's a jet boat, and this is the Mahays jet boat company. They run these tours from Talkeetna during the summer up to basically like the first or the last, depending on which way you're going, major rapid of the canyon, and the tourists kind of gawk. And I actually, uh, the summer before 2012, I wanted to kind of scout out Devil's Canyon a little bit. I wanted to leave some food. So I actually enlisted a jet boat ride, and they dropped me off on the bank, and like all the tourists like were clapping as I got out. And I brought a full bear can. I stashed it somewhere for myself, um, as a resupply, partly for like emergency and stuff like that. And then I was going to do it in the fall, and then I didn't. So it was just there all winter. I didn't know for sure if I was going to go back at all. So I had bought this bear can and everything and left all this. And I ended up finding it and got my food in my bear can. I ended up encountering a wolverine up in the canyon. I thought it was like a little like a baby black bear in a tree, and I kind of walked and I was like, "Oh no, baby black bear!" And it like snarled at me, and I was like, "Oh gee, that's a wolverine." I don't know if that's better or worse. So I just kind of backed away. But anyway, Steve Mahay, I think, kind of started this riverboat company, and he uh, was the first and only person to take a jet boat through Devil's Canyon. But he went upstream, which is what you would do, in this kind of custom modified boat. And there's actually a documentary online about this journey. And so I'm going to stop my slideshow. I just want to show you like a minute of it, but I have to actually,
I think
oh,
we
here
could
we go.
hear your sound before as
Oh,
well.
you could.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay, well, let's see if it works. That would be great. So I was going to show this one. It's kind of this cheesy-ish movie from like 90, early 90, like not because of what it's about, but because of the era that it came from, kind of this 80s, 90s production. But there's one part that I thought was pretty good. I want to show you. Let's just let it load for a second.
Cool. And you'll have to share the screen again.
Oh, shoot. Okay, one second. Sorry.
No, no worries. So while you're doing that, Ralph Baldwin is asking what, and this is something to ponder because I think you'll probably have a pretty long answer to it. But what conclusions did you reach after your journeys through this wild landscape and your graduate studies regarding what constitutes the wild and the value it can have in our modern lives?
Oh, yeah.
That's something to ponder for when we
Let,
get to the end. That's
yeah,
a
let me just whip out a 15-second
yeah.
answer.
That's a big one.
Yeah, yeah, no, I have some thoughts about that.
Yeah.
Hold on. Okay, let me see. Hopefully this works.
Some say this great Susitna
Is it
River
working?
should never have been attempted. One
Never been
more
attempted.
piece
Yeah,
of Alaska's vanishing wilderness was captured. But has there really been any damage done? The river is still there, unchanged, as if the boat had never passed through its raging current. But the captor, wearing his crown of glory, has changed. A man has accepted a challenge, and with careful planning and preparation, he has turned a dream into reality. The river remains unchanged, but Steve Mahay will never be the same.
Okay. So, like I said, kind of a little bit cheesy, but I like what stood out to me was it was like saying the river's never been changed. And I was like, well, that's so interesting. It relates to this whole like dam, but it actually relates to the question too. Like, what's the value in going into this kind of area and encountering the wild, and what do you take with you? And I mean, that was a huge question. I think I'm going to save that if there's time towards the end, but
Yeah.
and there's not that much more. Like Devil's Canyon's kind of like the last big hurrah of this. But let me think about that. Let me finish this journey, and I think I'm maybe going a little bit long, so I'm gonna go quicker. But anyway, so you could just get more of a sense of the bush. There was lots of Devil's Club, and I had to like cut down this gully in front of me, which kind of resembles the gully you see on the other side, just like super steep and slick and loose rock. And I would be slipping, and like I'd reach out to grab something, and it would inevitably be Devil's Club, and just you get your hand all spiked. And so anyway, I was happy to be done, and I crashed down this beautiful river beach. Um, And by the way, I think some of these beaches would be kind of impacted by the presence of the dam. And anyway, I wrote this essay called 11 Miles of Hell, Portaging Devil's Canyon. And just from being in Alaska, I featured this in a magazine that I created, which is mostly satire, but also a little bit serious, called Brush and Bog, kind of a spoof on Rock and Ice. And so 11 Miles of Hell is one of the essays in it. And I kind of put out a group, or I made a crowdsource call to like get some entries and photos. And anyway, it's online. It's on Facebook, Brush and Bog. You can get a free copy, and you can like and subscribe. So you should do that, please. And there's only one issue, but maybe someday when I'm not busy, I'll do another. So I got through the canyon. I got to Portage Creek, and you can see the beautiful clear water joining the silty Susitna. There were brilliant red salmon swimming up it. There was an inscription right at Portage Creek by a group from July 2nd, 1897, including, among others, William Dickey. And William Dickey is infamously named Mount McKinley. And this was the year actually after he named Mount McKinley. So the real quick backstory is he was a gold prospector, and McKinley backed the gold standard as opposed to the silver standard. And so McKinley never been in Alaska. Anyway, that's how it got its name. And what Dickey wrote on I arrived on July 15, 2013, which was 122 years and 13 days later. And Dickey wrote in an article, finding the path very steep and difficult, dangerous even to carry our packs, so we gave up the attempt without seeing the falls, which must be very high from the appearance of the canyon and surrounding country. So he was under the impression, mainly from talking to local indigenous folks, probably through broken translations, that there was a falls. But actually, he published this map, and he wrote well, the falls, he means the rapids, but he put a big lake way at the top versus glaciers. And this map's pretty funny. One thing I'll just point out is the Glasgow Range says great range, very rugged and huge. So I was I wanted to document some of the infrastructure along the way. So I was like, I'm in under the rail belt transmission lines here, and just the way the landscape would change potentially. This very like not untouched, but so far not very industrial impact would be the more precise way to put it. Just the kind of things that could happen up in there. Hit my first the second bridge, the Alaska Highway Bridge. Notice this motorboat over here. It was the Alaska Energy Authority camp, and I kind of stumbled in their camp, and I met some of the same folks. And so I went from like this horrendous Devil's Canyon traverse all by myself to like playing baseball in this camp. I floated down. Along the way, there are more scientists working, like catching fish, putting in radio tags. Anyway, I made it to Talkeetna, and here the Susitna joins the Talkeetna and the Chitna, and just becomes huge. And there's Denali, a little sunset Denali photo. I'm going quick just so we have a little time for discussion if we want, just to get to the end of this. But I noticed a lot of kind of resistance messaging to the Susitna Dam. The Denali Brewing Company made this like special table mat. There was graffiti on the Talkeetna River Bridge, said no Sioux Dam. And then the Coalition for Susitna Dam Alternatives had a table. And I guess that was the precursor to the Susitna River Coalition.
Yep.
And some of the arguments, I won't get into it very long, but some of the arguments against the dam include like the presence of fault lines in the area, and the prospect that potentially the dam could fail and flood maybe downstream river communities. None are important nearby that I know of, but it could happen, let's say. I'm being joking. Talkeetna's below, and whether a giant tsunami wave would hit Talkeetna, I don't know, but that's one of the thoughts. I would also change like the flow regime below the dam in terms of temperature, siltation, and also just the amount of flow and when it would come seasonally. The floods wouldn't come in the same way. I encourage you to read more, talk to intelligent folks about that, just so I can zip through this. But so anyway, I came back in the fall. I put it in Talkeetna, and I waved goodbye to the beautiful Alaska Range. I crossed under the George Parks Highway Bridge, and I got into the realm of giant cottonwoods and giant beavers. And it had been raining a lot, so the river was just crank it, and it was awesome. I mean, it's not rapids, although there were actually like little sections of rapids when it would the river on the edges was flowing over trees and stuff. And I met some moose and bear friends going down along the way. And at one point, I swear I remember this, and I believe it's true. I paddled my boat in a circle, and I could witness in that circle 5 different mountainous areas. That was the Alaska Range, the Talkeetna Mountains, Mount Spur, and the Todrio Range, the Chugach Range, and Mount Susitna. So I'm sticking with that memory. So here's Mount Susitna, sleeping lady, kind of see a head and the body and the legs, and you can see I'm just looking out with the weather. And the Yetna joins, and this river just becomes like the Amazon. Actually, I had been to the Amazon, and it would totally remind me of the Amazon, I guess, at least compared to the upper sections in terms of vegetation and how big it was. And making my way down to the ocean, it's kind of fall time. I passed this big transmission line, the last big piece of infrastructure. Basically, this connects the Beluga natural gas plant, which is the main, one of the main power plants for supplying Anchorage with power. You can see a picture of it there. And I got into like the last big challenge, which was Cook Inlet in the ocean. So Cook Inlet has some of the largest tidal differentials in the world. I think somewhere in Norway like has #1, and this is up there with among the top. And you can see a picture on the left of like some satellite images of how, giving some sense of like how much that changes. And so there's just these massive tidal mud flats everywhere, and they're super dangerous. It's not uncommon that people like walk or ATV out there and then kind of get stuck because it can be like quicksand, and they just can't go anywhere. And then this like these board tides just come in like a big wave and just freezing cold water. Just that's the end. So I knew I didn't want to mess around. And anyway, there are ways to travel through these areas safely, and I was doing that. That's also true of glaciers and a lot of stuff I was doing. I developed these skills and things. So just to mention that, but it's just amazing. I was just amazed at these mud canyons and how tall some of these mud flats were, just the range of this water. And one real quick thing I'll point out, anyway, like you can't see it, but actually way off in the distance on these mud flats was a beached jet boat that I noticed. So I don't know if they did that intentionally or accidentally, probably accidentally, but they were stuck until the tide rolled in. Hopefully they got out safely. I kind of got in a little bit of marshy area. This is Fire Island across Cook Inlet towards Anchorage. And one idea I had was to paddle across to Fire Island and then go across Anchorage. But when I looked out at that sea and I saw those clouds, I was like, that seems like a terrible idea. I don't want to do that. So I kind of just I used the tide and just paddled up to the Knik Arm towards Anchorage. So here's the Todrio Mountains, which basically is the transition between the Alaska Range to the Aleutians. And I camped right across from Anchorage, and it was just amazing to watch the tides roll in and out, and just to see the twinkling lights and hear the distant motorcycle sounds. And I was like, gosh, where else could you camp across from a pretty big city just like that? But it didn't occur to me at the time. Funny enough, I was doing this energy project. It just occurred to me like today that I was witnessing basically like a huge potential source of power, which is these massive tidal differentials in the Cook Inlets. This is a tidal resource map that National Renewable Energy Laboratory has put out. It says Cook Inlet is one of the United States' leading potential sites for tidal energy generations. I won't read the rest of it. And there's also like geothermal potential in the area. So the next morning, I waited for the tide to go out so that it was a little shorter distance, and I was kind of uncovering some artifacts. And I paddled across, and I saw this like giant piece of like rusty debris, and I circled around it, and it had Japanese script on it. So I said, I wonder if that was brought over from the Fukushima tsunami, because actually things were washing up like in the coast of Washington. I have no idea. Anyway, I plotted up this like steep, gooky mud up to the city of Anchorage. You can see across the arm is Mount Susitna, and that's where I'd camped in those woods over there. And you can just see how steep and muddy that plodding up to the city is. And I walked through town, these muddy, stinky, dry suit, and got someone to take a photo of me. And that was it. That was the journey. So I hope that didn't go too long, but thank you for listening, and let's talk. If you're still here and want to converse or have questions, we should do that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chris. It's hard to truncate such a incredibly long and varied journey. So thank you so much for putting all that together and providing so much background and really relating it to the Sioux Dam project. Um, so I think we do have time for questions if folks want to stick around. I'm sure there are a lot. And so I think we have one more philosophical that's in the
Yeah,
chat.
what was that? Tell me that question again. That was a good question.
Yeah,
We could spend all day answering that one, but
I know. I feel
what
like
was it again?
what conclusions did you reach after your journeys through the landscape and your graduate studies regarding what constitutes the wild and the value it can have in our modern lives? This is a classic. It's like the wilderness
That's a
man.
leading question. Somebody knows me, whoever wrote that. Okay.
Ralph Baldwin.
Yeah, I don't know. But okay, so all right. So I did an essay. I did an essay that I wrote up, which I was just reading recently again, and I can do better. I should maybe rewrite it, but it's pretty good. And it's online. And oh, I want to share you guys some links. So I'm gonna do that while I'm talking. Because I got some great links to share with you. So I'm gonna do that.
And I can
Okay,
also,
so
if you have anything you'd like to share, I'd like to send out an email after events with any follow-ups. So,
awesome. So one thing I talk about in the essay was one of the things that I'd been working for Denali, and Denali's like highly managed in the sense that like you have to get like a wilderness permit, be a particular area. And there is land ownership and there's hunting regulations and stuff like that. But out there it just felt like this huge wild area that like compared to even places in Alaska, it was just like almost nobody was there. Like nobody's like babysitting you. It's just like nothing's going on. And that was one like insight I had into what I would say the value in terms of wildness of that area. And and it's similar with the river. That it was just like this continuous, it just as I mentioned at the beginning, like just getting this experience of this continuous connected river that went all the way with like basically no intrusion, that follows all its cycles that it's been following, since time immemorial, as they say. The floods come, the ice comes, and earthquakes come, and this comes, and that comes, and it's just like that's just the way it is. And so, just to get a little taste of that was really amazing, and that you couldn't to access these areas was really hard. I mean, people were one thing I didn't mention is there were like helicopters flying over from study and stuff like that. But anyway, I could say a lot more about that, but I'd encourage you to maybe check out the essay for a little bit more.
and then there was a follow-up question with that, which if you were forced to name three critical ideas, I think that came from this, what would they be?
Oh man. My head is like tired from like giving you this like full on like journey,
Yeah.
and now I'm like you're asking like legit questions here. Three main like
Maybe
what was the
takeaways.
word?
What are kind of three main takeaways you had from this experience?
Well, I mean, it was definitely, I learned a lot. I learned a lot from just going through the process of like planning this and doing it. And kind of like the Steve Mahay thing, it was like the river remains unchanged, but he has changed. But I think there is something like transformative. Okay, so one thing is that middle section was quite long. And besides those scientists, I didn't see anyone like the whole time, basically. And just being out there and like doing it every day. And since then, I've done like more long journeys, but there is something you just kind of relax into a different mental place of like attunement, of awareness. And I definitely remember being like where that bridge was in the background where I was playing around the river, and being in the sun. I just totally remember like, I just feel like this kind of relaxation that I only get in wilderness, right? Just like the expansiveness of self, and like the whole world is just gone. Like what's going on out there, I have no idea. So there's just that, like it's just kind of a usual wilderness lesson, but I remember it very distinctly on this trip, particularly in that section. And it was also because it was just so hard to go through the canyon. So that was definitely one thing. And so just like the planning. I think I'm going to stop there, but that's one big one was kind of the transformational and the growth aspect.
Interesting. All right, well that actually leads really nicely into another question, which is for people wanting to attempt a big trip like this one or some of the other ones that you have done. What tips do you have for pulling the trigger on doing or just doing it, and even when it seems huge? Um, how did your first big trip go, and what would you have done differently?
Yeah. Well, okay. This is like the first big trip in the way that like I'm not like following a trail. There's no plan. Nobody knows. And this is like big, huge, remote country. So I call this like a proper big trip. But I had done like what a lot of people would call big trips. Like I'd done most of the Great Divide Trail, which runs from Montana border up towards north of around Prince George. I mean, that was proper. And I spent a lot of the summer doing that. And that was, I remember again, I was like, I had a lot of anxiety. I was like rolling around at night sometimes, like thinking about all the what ifs but I was just like, I'm just gonna do this. But I planned like crazy. But even that, like I had before that, I had worked seasonally in Denali for a couple of seasons. And so this was like big. This was a really big step for sure. But I also had done an awful lot. And a lot of those steps each time felt like a big step. There's kind of like a similar feeling, at least for me, that kind of comes, which is like, I feel like I'm stepping over this void, but I'm doing a lot I'm putting a lot into it. I'm not just doing it. A lot of planning and not like hyper. I think it's actually the wrong approach to be like hyper obsessive about every little thing where you're going to be each day. And this, like, you got to leave a lot of room,
Right.
but don't just like go out there with a bag of rice. You know what I mean? Not naming names, but don't do that. So I think there's kind of a psychological dimension to it, but also there is definitely an iterative dimension. And there are things that like my first season in Denali, I like walked out on glaciers that were covered with snow to climb mountains. I had no idea that that was something that you should not do. And I learned and I was like, oh, that was really bad. So there are things that might have never seen me again. So there's a balance. There's a balance between taking the big step and not, and making sure that you're not taking too big of a step because there's just you don't know what you don't know kind of a thing. So I think that's one way I would kind of paraphrase the whole trajectory that I've taken is iteration, but also big steps.
What was your favorite piece of gear?
Oh man. Well, you say I had kind of an older school pack raft. It didn't have the zipper. You had to like put the pack on the front. They didn't even have the zippers at the time, but I mean the pack raft is really awesome. I had a Hilleberg tent that I didn't actually like it that much. Oh no, I might be confusing. I had this solo one that I don't really like the solo one. That's not the non-dome for. I think that might have been the one I had. Oh no, that was one of anyway. I'm getting confused. I've done a lot of trips, but uh let's see. Oh, I splurged for an Arc'teryx Gore-Tex jacket, and I remember one day in the headwaters, it was just like pouring cold, 30 degrees something rain all day. And I was like, I'm like dry. That's nice. Um, so like Alaska, just the weather, Alaska is really a weather state, a weather place. That's one of the biggest challenges, I think. And so that just means you have to have more weight. Like I used to be more ultralighty when I was kind of lower 48, a little more in the ultralight. And then I got to Alaska and I just kept putting more and more weight in my pack. It's like it's
Yeah.
just worth it. So yeah, just like you want the bet, if you're gonna do big stuff in Alaska, you want quality gear that's gonna keep you dry. I think that's like the big thing I would say.
Yeah. Yeah, the ultralight stuff gets shredded in the brush pretty quick.
Oh, that too, yeah. And the wind, like I do bring ultralight tent, not on this trip, or at least I did. Actually, I used different tents for different sections because I was doing different things. But this middle section out of Hilleberg, but I did another trip where I was using more like a single pole kind of ultralight tent. It was kind of old, and this wind came and snapped the pole right in half. I was like getting ready to go to bed, and it's just like protruding through the top, and I'm like, oh hell. what am I going to do? I'm just going to be out here in the rain. And anyway, I managed to do some kind of stopgap thing. And then I ended up floating to this lodge. It was the Wood River. I ended up at this lodge and I was like, can you fix this? And they had this like heavy copper tubing and that worked. And anyway, so I guess that's a story or a lesson. I don't know.
Maybe a bit of both. Well, um, just wanted to check in and see if folks have any more questions, but I also want to say it's pretty impressive. I feel like so many of us, especially here in Talkeetna, are particularly familiar with this section of river just right outside our, well, down Main Street. And it's really fun and interesting to see your photos of the glacier and see what it's like up there and really get to dive into that piece of the river because it's what we're not quite as familiar with. And it really paints a picture of just how much this river changes over the course of its flow and how it's not this one thing that we see down at the end of Main Street. And every river mile is a little different. Every half mile river mile is probably pretty different and has a different character. And how much all of that would change if something like the the Susitna-Watana Dam would be put in place. So thank you for really painting a picture there. But I did want to check in. Does anybody else have any more questions? Or Chris, do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, I guess it's kind of one way, like people can't really chime in the way we have it, but have proper conversation. But I'm just looking through some of the, yeah, I guess more on the energy side. Oh, so someone was asking about the PhD. So I've done a lot of work on the idea of wildness and wilderness. That's a lot of what I've written about in various capacities. And so this did actually inform that. I mean, I had done a master's before this, kind of on some of those ideas, and I was kind of bringing some of those in to this already. But I would say this fed into, shaping those ideas, to go back to that question. And it really has, I mean, this led to a whole, like I said, a whole long series of things that have kind of fallen. I just keep developing it every single time. And just the ability to like present this multiple times, like I feel like I get a little better and I tinker here and there. And so just a lot of things have come out of it in that way in terms of informing my scholarship and my work. And so I owe the Susitna something, I guess that's one way of putting it. And then on the energy front, well, it's like certain things didn't come up, but like there are questions about what does renewable energy even mean? What makes something renewable? And I mean, a dam has a shelf life and a dam has a lot of implications. And is that the right way to think of it? And I don't think I have to tell, if it's local folks or coalition folks, I don't have to tell you that there's a lot of energy potential in Alaska and other places, but every energy development comes at a cost. So I think one theme that I've really been developing lately, I've spent some time in Iceland, that's a big theme I need to write about, is that renewable energy has a cost.
Yeah.
There is no costless energy, even if it is renewable. And there's a lot I could say about it. I'm just trying to keep it simple, but one of the things that I wanted to unearth is this is hard to get to. Most people aren't flying in to these places like at the time that this was being studied. Like I want to kind of present to you this underbelly and show you like, hey, there is this cost, here's the cost, through sort of trying to present, here's the experience I had, here's the beauty that's there. That doesn't mean absolutely you don't do it. It means here's another piece to think about in relation to all of this that doesn't get captured in like environmental assessments. They're not describing the beauty of the place. That's not in the legislation to consider typically in relation to deciding to develop something. So that was kind of the idea, was to offer that. Anyway, that was maybe a little rambly, but
No,
I
thank
think
you.
it's my concluding thought.
No, thank you so much. I feel like these are the kind of conversations that could continue on for a really long time, and they're so much fun to have. And thank you for bringing these thoughts and questions to our community and for sharing your journey. And really appreciate you being here.
Sure, yeah. Thanks for the opportunity. Maybe we'll
Yeah.
see you in Alaska sometime.
Yeah, definitely. Just so everyone here knows, this is again our first winter speaker event of this season. We are hoping to host quite a few in-person events this year. The next event will be in December. We're going to have two nights seminars with Alaska Safe Riders that will be free to the public. And so just stay tuned, sign up for our newsletter if you'd like to be informed about that. And we'll have a lot more going on through April. So as always, no Sudam, and thank you so much for being here tonight and chiming in, and thanks Chris for the time and imagery that you shared with us tonight.
Yeah, have a good one.
All right, bye everyone.